Brilliant. Okay. Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the first episode of the Black Radicals. Um, I think for the first episode of Black Radicals, I thought it was important to invite our current guest, who I'll introduce in a minute, because I think more than a lot of people or more than a lot of authors, I've learned a lot from her and from her work. And yeah, I thought I would start this podcast with her work so that we can maybe delve into like the topic of race and racialization and race theory and so on and so forth. And so for today, I'm very, very excited and happy to have this conversation with Professor Alana Lentin. Professor Alana Lentin is a professor of cultural and social analysis at Western Sydney University. Um, she's written she's written multiple books and articles. The two that I'm going to be talking about today with her is going to be why race still matters and the new racial regimes. Yeah, with that, welcome Alana Linton. How are you today?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Nice, nice. I think just from the off, I would just like to ask you about like the view building blocks so that we can like maybe complicate it a little bit later on. And with that, can you just tell us what, I know this might be a simple question, but maybe a little bit complex, but what race is and what racism is?
Okay. Actually, those questions are not very simple. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of contestation around what these two things are. The way I've defined it in the book that you mentioned, which is the book that I published in 2020, Why Race Still Matters, I defined race as a technology for the management of human difference. And I wrote that its main aim, the aim of race, is to maintain white supremacy, both on a local scale and on a global scale. And that definition is actually has quite a lot in common with other people's definitions of race. Most notably, I think Geraldine Heng in her book "The Invention of Race in the Middle Ages," the European Middle Ages, in which she spoke about this the need for race as a technology for of management. She doesn't necessarily use the terminology of technology, but she does talk about managing human differences, which I think is really important. There's two concepts there that are key. One is management, and the other is difference. And differentiation is also very key to the way in which the Black radical political scientist Cedric Robinson, whose work I build on significantly in the other book you mentioned, The New Racial Regime Recalibrations of White Supremacy, Cedric Robinson, in his magnus opus, I guess, Black Marxism, the making of the Black radical tradition, of course, which came out originally in 1983, but has been republished multiple times. And I'm sure we'll get to speak about it a little bit more. In the first chapter of Black Marxism, he talks about the tendency of European civilization to differentiate, not to homogenize. And that's the way he speaks about what racial capitalism is, which is, of course, slightly different to race. Robinson talks about racialism rather than racism. And I think that's also an interesting way to talk about it. Racism is very much tethered to the idea of an ideology rather than a practice. And I think that that way of talking about racism in relation to race has become relatively problematic. So one of the things that I take up in, again, in Why Race Still Matters is a quote from the African American author Ta-Nehisi Coates, in which he talks about racism being, or race being the child of racism. Sorry, let me start again. Race being the child of racism. Okay. And he says that the tendency in dominant discourse, and I would disagree with this, but he says that the tendency is to think of race being coming before racism, and he wants to turn that on its head. And I actually problematize that, because what he's saying, what I think is key also in certain Marxist thinkers, I'm thinking of the Karen and Barbara Fields in their work on racecraft, but also in very many left-wing tendencies to think about racism as this kind of, I don't want to say pre-packaged ideology, but an ideology. And of course, as Patrick Wolf, another key figure, says, race is already an ideology, right? So we don't necessarily have to talk about a distinction between race and racism. But what they would say, or what these left-wing authors and Ta-Nehisi Coates also takes this up, says is that racism has an ideological function, which then produces the idea of race. But that kind of view of things, which is based on, I guess, the dominant 19th century conception of race as this kind of hierarchy of differences that are ordered from sort of, whiteness at the top to blackness at the bottom, to use this very kind of crude distinction, thinks about race hierarchically rather than thinking about these two key functions of race as being, as again, as I said earlier, management and differentiation. So these two things going at the same time, which means that they can also work horizontally, right? They don't necessarily also always have to work vertically. So if we think about race as a technology, as a set of practices, always attached to a set of discourses, as we'll get into, I think, when we talk about the racial regime, then it becomes slightly more complex to think about racism as this ideology that then forms this idea of a hierarchy of races. Because as Stuart Hall, another key author, would say, race has different iterations over time, different modes of expression, and also these things are always articulated with each other. So they don't necessarily exist in kind of distinct era. So we first talk about race as having a geographical, being based on the geographical idea, very much tethered to Christianity, and then only thinking about it in biological terms. All of these things kind of coexist, the cultural and the biological, and so on. These kind of coexist at the same time, and have a much longer history than what is usually thought about. So that's kind of a long answer to a kind of a simple question. Maybe there are a few threads that I have left untied, and I don't know, maybe you want to come back to some of those.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think you've left. I think that there's a couple of threads there that are, I don't know which one to pick, but for Cedric Robinson, I think just to end off with the last thing that you said, I think he traces race back to sometime during feudalism, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which his conceptualization, I suppose, is what you're saying is a little bit different than seeing it from the 19th century hierarchical.
Yeah.
But simultaneously, on that note, I think in your second book, or the new racial regime, you sort of tie it specifically to white supremacy. So there is a tendency, because I think sometimes when you say that, or not when you say, but like when if you don't tie it to white supremacy, then you have somewhat like people saying that the new racism is basically the racism against white people, for
Mm.
example. Maybe that's something that I thought was interesting in your book. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because there has been some debate about the utility of the terminology around white supremacy. And I recommend listening to, I think it's a two-part series or maybe even three-part series that they did on one of my favorite podcasts, the Black Myths podcast, in which Two Black and Rasul Mawat kind of take apart the idea of white supremacy. But that's just a kind of a nerdy aside. I do think that it's important to center whiteness, or if you like, Europeanness or Westernness. And I understand people who want to problematize the differences between these things and not necessarily think of them as being one and the same. But I do think that, the distinction between Europeanness and non-Europeanness is standing for a distinction between gradations of the human, which is something else that another theorist that I admire, Alexander Wehelier, has spoken about, this kind of gradation that race constitutes between the human, the not quite human, and the non-human, that these
Mhm.
often follow kind of patterns of Europeanness and non-Europeanness, which is, of course, is the primary contradiction that colonialism and later imperialism established. And on a global scale, if we think about race as having this meaning on a global scale, I think those distinctions still apply. And I think to gloss over them would be
Mhm.
relatively, dangerous to do, particularly when we look at the goings on in, right now as we're
Mhm.
speaking, with American incursions on Venezuela, with the mooting of war in Iran, with, of course, the continuing genocides in Palestine, Sudan, and Congo, I mean, in the end of the day, we're talking about the imposition of Western imperialism, which itself is constituted by race. And I do think also that the effort to disentangle or to separate between these two things and to consider, which is quite, I think, a mainstream view, to consider race as somehow being an add-on or an
Hmm.
aside to these processes rather than being the central logic around which these processes cohere, which is very much the way in which Cedric Robinson would see it. I think this is problematic because then we ultimately end up where you start saying with this idea that there could be something like an anti-white racism, because if you see
Hmm.
racism as going in all kinds of directions, then you lose this idea of what race, the function of race to begin with is. So let's just take it back to Robinson for a moment when he talks about the origins of race as emerging within the context of European feudalism, which he sees as the kind of the instigator of capitalism, which he says, which he names as racial capitalism, because he says that this tendency to differentiate, not to homogenize, which emerges in this era in Europe, in which you have different populations from different parts of the continent. Of course, Europe, as we know it today, doesn't exist as a kind of an idea,
Yeah.
but this area of the world where you have different people migrating for labor purposes, very similar to the way in which we see it today. And then you have burgeoning capitalism emerging and putting to work differently people who are constituted as wholly different to each other for the purposes of, you know, different forms of labor, and the way in which people can be enslaved for those purposes at the same time. You start to see these practices emerging or being consolidated, and that's when you have this kind of development of, if not the ideology of race, but definitely the practice of race, which means to differentiate people and to manage them, to come back to my definition, on the basis of their value or their utility, right? And that way of thinking about how to manage human populations then becomes a central technology or tool for the expansion of capitalism across the globe. And that's why he talks about capitalism being racial. I don't really like these kind of maxims or these slogans like all capitalism is racial
Hmm.
capitalism. Okay, fine. But how does that happen in
Hmm.
specific detail is the work that we need to do. And how does that then attach itself, or how do different discourses or ideologies or, yeah, how do they
Yeah.
attach themselves to these practices in order to embed them culturally
Hmm.
in language and in society? These are the things that I'm interested in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you mentioned this in your book as well about a slight critique towards, people using the word racial capitalism to define everything. Um, I suppose from that perspective, one of the interesting things that I found in your second book, The New Racial Regime, was when you speak about anti-Semitism specifically, since we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
Europe. I think, for example, you make the point that while today, because of the genocide or the accelerated genocide in Palestine, people sort of tend to see it as, the weaponization of weaponization of Jewishness or the Jew or the European Jew. For you, you say, well, that takes it out of perspective because there was always sort of the Jewish person was always necessary for I suppose I don't want to like put words in your mouth, but for European racialization or can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so in the fifth chapter of the new racial regime, which is called Against Definitions, and it's called Against Definitions because I deal with what's now become kind of the vehicle of, well, what we could call, after the Palestinian sociologist Ihab Shalbak, mandatory Zionism. The vehicle for that has been things like, or principally, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism, that I don't think anybody listening to this podcast is a stranger to, unfortunately, but because it's become sort of embedded in law and policy across the West. And the chapter makes an argument against using Cedric Robinson's work uh, in his in his essay, a couple of his essays, but principally the first attack is an attack on culture, in which he takes up Marx's classical essay on the Jewish question, in which he talks about the need for us to reject the terms of order, which is, of course, the title of his first book. And I therefore use that as a way of arguing against the incorporation of definitions of racism by institutions that are established in order to discipline and racialize people. So that's why the chapter is called Against Definitions, and maybe we can talk about more about that then. But what I consider to be very important in that chapter was first to actually trace the way in which anti-Semitism, or the trajectory through which anti-Semitism has become kind of ubiquitous. And it actually builds on the work that I did in the other book that you spoke about, Why Race Still Matters. So the fourth chapter of that book, which is called Good Jew, Bad Jew, talks about the way in which the fight against anti-Semitism has become a proxy for all forms of anti-racism, which, again, when I wrote that book, so I wrote it in 2018, 2019, I think those things have become absolutely clear to us in the context of this current phase of Israel's genocide in Palestine, and the way, again, in which mandatory Zionism is being pushed down everybody's throat using these kinds of mechanisms. And many of the things that I wrote about in that book, I think, are just, are completely understood by people. So in this book, what I wanted to try to do was to trace further this trajectory of anti-Semitism, not by trying to say that, by trying to argue further against the exceptionalization of anti-Semitism as, if you like, your type of racism, which is the way in which it's treated in dominant discourse. So there's this notion that after the Nazi genocide, which is referred to as the Holocaust, the Nazi genocide of the Jewish people, that after then, that this form of racism, that or what is conceived of as Nazi ideology targeting Jewish people, leading to the final solution, is the kind of the example par excellence of what racism is. And as I explained in previous work, including in Why Race Still Matters, every other form of racism is kind of compared and contrasted to that. And if it differs from this in any kind of way, then it might not really be racism. And we have all these interminable arguments that I discuss in my last book about what really is and is not racism. And not racism, which is the title of a chapter in that book, is kind of used to argue against people speaking about their own experiences of racism and discounting them as not really being racist. And this example is constantly used in order to police the boundaries of what can be considered racism and not racism. So that argument is there. But what I wanted to try to do in this book is to place the history of anti-Semitism within the history of racial capitalism. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done on that. And I say this here. But one of the ways in which I try to do this is to think a little bit about the function of the Jew, following again Robinson's discussion of Marx's on the Jewish question, for the formation of European ideas about itself. And what Marx says in that essay that Robinson takes up is that the Jewish question is not about Jews, it's about German society at that time. And we could argue that today, Jewish people, or the idea that Jewish safety is paramount, and therefore we need to aggressively police the boundaries of what people who stand with Palestinians can say about Israel and Zionism, because of course these two things are collapsed into being the same as Jewish people, then that policing of the boundary becomes what anti-racism is. And the function of this is not, as many people think, to kind of express some kind of guilt that Europeans, or especially Germans, have about the Nazi past and their implication, their kind of continuing implication with it. Although I think that exists, but I don't think that's the dominant, that's the dominant driver. I think the dominant driver for putting Jewish safety, again, big scare quotes around that, at the heart of this aggressive policy is about the protection of what I call, following Siddhant Issar and his colleagues in this brilliant essay called On the Primitive Accumulation of Whiteness, Homo Europaeus, right, at the center, and the need for the protection of Homo Europaeus, or European man, or we could say European civilization or Europeanness or Western values or whatever else we want to, whatever other label we want to use at the center, and to place not actual Jews, but the chimera of Jews or the figure of the Jew, which is an idea, right? It's not actual people, in front as a shield for the defense of European civilization, which is, of course, undergoing justifiable and legitimate attack from below, from the global masses who are entirely opposed to Europeanness, because, of course, that is the source of the tragedy of the world in the modern era. And so that's what I'm interested in, the function of Jews, Jewishness as an idea, as a chimera, as a symbol, as a cipher, in order to aggressively attack any kind of resistance to European domination.
Yeah. I think well, this podcast is in Germany. I think we're very familiar on I suppose not
Of
familiar with the
course,
theory,
yeah,
but it's very intuitive to us. I think I mean I'm sure you've seen the videos and maybe read the articles and stuff like that, but
of course. And
the
one of
kind
the key, sorry, I should just say that one of the people whose work has really informed my own is the German or the Palestinian German scholar Anna Yunus and her work on the war on anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to mention that in relation to Germany.
Yeah. I mean, Germany has been in that regard very brutal, and perhaps they've maybe I don't know, maybe this might be a little bit too much, but I think they might have used the European Jew in the current accelerated form, the current acceleration of the Palestinian genocide, perhaps more so than many other. Maybe the US is extreme, but that brings me out
Mm,
another question or another link that you make in the book, which is the link between, I think you just talked about it, the link between white supremacy and Zionist anti-Semitism or and so on. And I think in the book you make the particular example of, I think it was the Aborigines in what is today called Australia, um, and the Zionist lobby there, or the Zionist groups there, where they sort of suggest that you need to be, or they quote it as like indigeneity should be sort of resilience and not victimhood to basically
mm,
whitewash their genocide or their violence, so on and so forth. If you can talk about that, but also maybe in this moment it would be good to also talk about how it's not just in Australia, but also, for example, today we're seeing protests for Iran, for example, and a lot of
mm,
Iranian people, a lot of like Iranian diaspora, like wave the old Iranian flag with the Israeli flag. In Somaliland, we're seeing it as well.
mm.
Here in Germany, there's like different outfits of this. And before that, I think also maybe just a correction. I think there's a tendency to call the lobby theory, like the Israel controls or the Zionist lobby sort of
Oh, yeah.
controls everything. And I'm not, I don't think you're saying that. I think you specifically in the book say that's not what you believe, and that's not what I believe. But there is a can you help us like sort of deconstruct this sort of link?
Yeah, so what you're referring to is my argument in the fourth chapter of the New Racial Regime, which is it's titled Capturing Indigeneity, Colonizing Decolonization. And there's a number of threads in this chapter, but my main aim, I suppose, is to pick apart the concept which is used by Zionist groups in order to justify the colonization of Palestine, which is this notion of Jewish indigeneity to what they would call Israel. And I do this via a kind of a linkage that I make between this and specific politics that cohere in the continent where I'm currently based, so called Australia, which is around the indigenization of institutions and the role that particular Zionist actors, in collusion with certain Indigenous figures, and I want to say that they're very much in the minority among Indigenous people, be it here or in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or in other places where this phenomenon also exists. This is the minority. However, some of them do have positions of power, very close to government and to other key figures. And again, I think it's important to reiterate that when I talk about Zionists, very um, very often, yes, for people conjure up this idea of a powerful lobby, the idea that the tail is wagging the dog, and so on. And following most anti-imperialist scholars and activists on this, um, I completely reject that thesis. And I think, for example, I just wrote an article yesterday on my Substack in which talking about this in the Australian context, saying that, the Prime Minister of Australia is not a Zionist bootlicker, which is the way he was described by one journalist. He is a Zionist because being a Zionist is based on what your actions are. And the government of the sub-imperial power of Australia is in lockstep with, Western imperialism in its support for Zionism. And the kind of slogan I came up with is Zionism is Australianism. In other words, there is no difference between these two things. And the reason why key figures within Australia would support the notion that Zionism is legitimate because Jews are indigenous to Palestine or to Israel, as they would see it, is because that kind of drives a similar logic like in all settler colonies where white dominance over indigenous lands is justified through the idea of, a kind of manifest destiny where European rule is legitimized because of the unspoken today, I suppose, idea of European supremacy over the entire earth, as Du Bois probably would have put it or did put it. So this is why I'm interested in it again. So rather than thinking about again the machinations of a kind of a covert lobby working its way in the background. And so what I talk about in the chapter, what I'm really interested in the chapter and throughout the book, really, because the book is about this concept of the racial regime, which, as I discuss, is always a kind of a chaotic and a messy process in which very contradictory things happen at the same time. So you have seemingly anti-racist discourses or practices being used in order to put down, for example, anti-genocide speech or protest. So I talk in the third chapter about how diversity, equity, and inclusion can be used in order to argue for the need to, again, promote Jewish or to ensure Jewish safety and therefore to stamp out any kind of activism for Palestine on campuses and things like that. That's in the third chapter. And in the fourth chapter, I look at how this is done via this mechanism of indigeneity or indigenization. And the interesting case that I point to was strangely, because of the dovetailing of dates, Australia held a referendum into what was called an Indigenous Voice to Parliament on the 14th of October 2023. So obviously 7 days after Tufan al-Aqsa. And this referendum, which was in order to establish what would ultimately have been a representative body made up of indigenous leaders, handpicked by the government, so not autonomously elected by indigenous peoples, handpicked by the government, that would have the possibility to advise the government on certain matters that are to do with indigenous peoples. So really its remit was relatively small already. The reason it required a referendum was because the idea was that it would be permanently installed and therefore necessitated a change to the constitution. In other words, this body, this voice to parliament, could not be taken away because advisory bodies have existed, for many decades, but this was a kind of a new and permanent feature. But the right wing successfully defeated this referendum. So I think it was defeated by 66% of the vote because the argument that was used, which was very, obvious argument that the right was going to use, was that this would lead to, settlers losing their rights, and that it was undemocratic because Aboriginal or Indigenous people would have rights that white or other settlers didn't have. And ultimately, it would lead to things like your property being taken away from you as Indigenous people demanded land back and so on. Now, of course, as many people, Indigenous people primarily quipped at the time, if it was going to lead to land back, that would be a great thing. But obviously, it was such a restrained and restricted kind of body to begin with. There was no way it was going to lead to that. And in fact, you know, dominant arguments that were made by people in favor of the referendum, particularly constitutional lawyers and so on, was like, don't worry, you're not going to lose any land. So you can, you can freely vote for it. And I remember having an argument outside the voting station when I went there, the white woman kind of handing me a leaflet and saying, don't worry, it won't change anything for you. And I turned around to her and I said, well, if it's not going to change anything, why are we having this thing? I mean, obviously we want things to change in this country, given the, abject rates of, child removals of indigenous families, deaths in custody, and impoverishment and so on that indigenous people still face on their own land. Anyway, that's the referendum, but it was defeated because the right was successful in its argument, and just goes to show the kind of the racism that's still so much part and parcel of the society. But what was missed in all of this was the fact that for many indigenous people, they were opposed to the idea of a voice to parliament for several reasons, mainly because by recognizing the parliament, this meant a recognition of the legitimacy or sovereignty of the Australian colonial project, and thus a delegitimizing of Aboriginal sovereignty over these lands. And there were other reasons, but I think that's the sort of the main reason that made sense for many people. There were also, things like it was an elitist project that made no sense to, your average or your sort of everyday Indigenous person, and so on and so forth. And these arguments were made. But in doing this, what was seen by several Indigenous activists, and I want to particularly mention important articles by Lorna Munro and Jasper Cohen Hunter and Kieran Stewart Asherton, who both wrote articles in edition 3 of a publication called the Sunday Paper on Resistance. They both wrote articles on this, and in particular, Lorna Munro's article speaks about a key figure, a man named Mark Liebler, who used to run the Australian, what do they call themselves, the Executive Council on Australian Jewry, which is the key kind of Zionist organization in Australia. And the fact that he seemed to be present everywhere at some of the negotiations or the talks that were held among Indigenous people in the lead up to the sort of the whole process of establishing the campaign for the Indigenous voice to Parliament. So I'm giving a very kind of long-winded story that might not be that clear to people who are not in Australia. I hope I've made it clear. Anyway, the details are more in the book. But to return to the kind of the crux of the matter, the point for me was less, obviously it was interesting. And as Lorna Munro asked in her article, why was this white man there at these talks that were supposed to be among Indigenous people? But I personally am less interested in that. What I was interested in was the way in which the figure of Mark Liebler, who again, it's not really about the individual, it's about what he represents and the function of his discourse, how he managed to attach this discourse of respect for, at least on the face of things, for Indigenous self-determination. And those words I use advisedly because these are words that his own company, his own law firm uses, right? So they renamed for their Reconciliation Action Plan, which is a kind of a nonsense that companies in Australia implement, or they write these words saying about respect for Indigenous people and so on. It doesn't really mean anything, but they renamed that the Indigenous self-determination or sovereignty plan or strategy or something like that. So it was interesting how these elite actors were using what appears to be the language of the Indigenous grassroots, right? The call for self-determination, the call for sovereignty, etc., etc. And the reasons were because this allows for a link to be made between Indigenous struggles here on these lands for sovereignty or for the recognition of, ongoing sovereignty of Indigenous peoples and for self-determination, and crucially for land back, to the the ideology of Zionism, which constitutes or attempts to constitute Jews as indigenous to Palestine, and therefore as having an exclusive right over the land, and to, as a strategy of justifying the genocide of Palestinians who are seen as standing in the way of Jews' legitimate right to this land. And that's the part that really interested me because, and then it allowed me to think about the function of institutions such as universities, where there are currently programs and policies being implemented to indigenize the curriculum, to indigenize staffing, to decolonize key, I guess, ways of doing things within the university, using again this language that grew organically through grassroots movements in institutions that are de facto based on the kind of practices of settler colonial expansionism on indigenous lands, right? So, in universities, as we know, are key actors for of racial capitalism, and we can see that absolutely clearly in the ways in which universities are in lockstep with, for example, weapons companies through developing research and entering into high with companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Thales, and all the different ones that we know are in lockstep with genocides, not only in Palestine, but globally. So these are the kinds of things that I was interested in. How is this language of indigeneity and indigenization being used actually for the furtherance of settler colonialism, not just in Palestine, but also here? Sorry
I
for the
think
long-winded answer.
no. Like I think that was very interesting. I think also there's a very, very strong link, I suppose, here in Germany, where I think a lot of it's a similar sort of situation, somewhat, but obviously with major differences, where I think for a long time that the left in Germany tried to incorporate. They had like something called the guest worker program. I'm sure you've heard
Mm,
of it. They tried to incorporate the sort of the guest worker program, or let's say racialized migrants, into the left. And for a long time they failed. And what you just said, and what you've written in the book sort of in a weird way sort of connected these with the indigenous, say, indigenous cause or struggle in what they would call Australia, because like you said about the indigenous in Australia and the racialized migrants in Germany, the racialized migrants in Germany never took actual, like like the organization part. They weren't part of it. Even, the
mm,
protests themselves, whenever they were part of it, they were only institutionalized, or they were only sort of presented as so-called the new Jew. So like the Jew of
mm,
the Holocaust, and so on and so forth. So it's always sort of not taking their perspectives, but
mm.
used as, even this was on the left, like it wasn't like a grassroots left as well. And they
Yeah.
kept on asking themselves, for example, why aren't there more um, racialized people joining our cause, or why are they not more like Antifa, or why are there not more, what's it called, racialized people within Antifa, and so on and so
Mm,
forth. So I thought, at least for me, that was pretty interesting, because
mm.
it doesn't take the people themselves position and what they're saying, or just the regular person, because they also obviously have like a strained, to use a euphemism, relationship with the state. But instead it's sort of like, oh, it's not actually about the state, it's about being the new Jew in Germany, or in the case of Australia, um, relating it to Zionism. But on that note, I wanted to ask, you mentioned something, if I'm not mistaken, it's in the first book, which is Why Race Still Matters, about, and this is, I think, important for the left generally, but specifically here in Germany, something called vulgar Marxism. So like
Mm.
theories about theories about racialization, and I think you used the book Hidden Identity, I think it was.
Mistaken
If I'm
identity.
mistaken, thank you. Mistaken identity. So can you talk us a little bit about this theory, and yeah, what your critique of it is?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of appears in both the books, to a certain extent. In Why Race Still Matters, I'm just looking to remind myself because I read it quite a few years ago, but the in chapter 3, which is called Making It About Race, I try to look at the argument from the left about, as they would see it, why focusing too centrally on race misses, as they would see it, as being the more important picture or the broader picture, which is the focus on class. And so, while in the second chapter of the book, I focus more on how the right dismisses claims of racism and talks about this idea of not racism that I mentioned briefly earlier, the left tends to go via a kind of dismissal of race, or I guess identitarianism, to use that language that they would use, not my language, in order to dismiss, I guess, the utility of race as an analytical concept. And in that book, in that chapter, I do engage with the arguments of the now departed, sadly, political theorist Assad Haider, who is
Rest in
the
peace.
or was yeah, who was the author of this book, Mistaken Identity. And I
Mhm.
feel a little bit uncomfortable, now that he's passed. But obviously, this is not personal. Um, discussing quite critically his book, particularly because it was so widely regarded, positively regarded at the time of its publication, heavily promoted. And I just think that the argument proceeds from a number of fallacies that weren't sufficiently interrogated. So that's why I tried to do it in the book. But I think his argument is just indicative of a wider process and a much more widespread process than what he tried to raise. And at least Assad Haider in his book did engage with Black radical writers and activists in making his critique. I don't think he dismisses race wholesale in the same way that other people do. So one of the other people I engage with in this chapter is the German, I guess, Marxist economist Wolfgang Streeck, who wrote an article that I actually responded to in 2017 about which he called on Trump and the Trumpists, in which he made the argument that was kind of very widespread at the time that the reason why Trump had been successful, this is Trump 1.0, first iteration of Trump, had been successful because he spoke to kind of disenfranchised white people from the Rust Belt in the United States who'd been kind of disenfranchised as a result of neoliberal capitalism and the elevation of identity politics over, I guess, bread and butter issues that ordinary everyday workers were concerned with. And of course, Streeck makes the racist mistake, frankly, of equating workers with white people, as though workers didn't come in all stripes, and that indeed the global working class were not mainly black and brown. I mean, this is something that he just didn't even take into account. I remember he wrote a sort of a response to my response that was just very dismissing, like, stupid woman, you don't know what you're talking about, kind of thing, like not even attempting to try to engage with what I was trying to say. But again, these kinds of arguments were very popular at the time because there was I think a real desire to think that even if we didn't like him, that Trump spoke to something that had been done unjustly to white people at that time. And if we think about it, this is very much in the context of the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement that many younger people, I think really only emerged in 2020 after the state murder of George Floyd. But of course, it had a whole almost decade before that, since the killing of the teenager Trayvon Martin in 2012. And Trump really, I think Trump's first election, but also his second election, but specifically his first election, could be seen as part of the backlash against Black Lives Matter, I think, very simply. And a lot of what people permitted themselves to say about the reason for Trump's success was because of basic racism and a reaction against the very piecemeal attempt to redress some of the abuses of racism, which then were doubled down on after George Floyd's murder with the so-called racial reckoning moment that I discuss more in the new racial regime, which of course, as you know, Too Black and Rasul Mawat talk about as the laundering of black rage. So this kind of repackaging of justifiable black rage into arts funding and DEI kind of programs, which I think is always very interesting for those of us who are not in the imperial core, as in the US part of the imperial core, to note, because of course, both in Germany and in so-called Australia, very little is done on the anti-racism front, and certainly almost nothing is done to talk about race in schools or universities. So this is very much, again, a conversation among kind of US Americans. But, you know, definitely that backlash existed. And as always, what happens in the US is taken to be more global than it really is. So then that backlash has echoes and, you know, domino effects across the globe. And so what I discuss in the second book, The War on Critical Race Theory, very much kind of takes on legs and runs in different societies where critical race theory has never even been heard of. Anyway, so that's kind of that's in relation to that. But in relation to vulgar Marxism, which is where you started your question, this idea that race is not important and class is, of course, completely misses the point. It's a very, very basic point for those of us who are interested in race theory, that, as Stuart Hall would have put it, race is the modality in which classes lived. In other words, there's no way in which you can extricate this one thing from the other thing. And the point is made just very simply with the example that I gave earlier, that you know the majority of the global working class is not white, right? And obviously, you know, on the basis of that, race is very central. But Assad Haider's point in his book, which is really an argument about identity politics, is that what was being done on US campuses, I guess, in the 2010s, was that race was being seen as the only way in which to organize, and that as a result, dialogue between, I guess, groups who were seen as kind of not having anything in common could not happen, and that meant that, as he would see it, real issues such as, for example, the struggle of negatively racialized cafeteria workers in the university could not be engaged with by all activists, because it could only be a Mexican issue, for example, if they were predominantly Mexican, or, you know, the struggles of Black cleaners, just for another example, could not be engaged in by Indian origin students because they weren't Black, right? And that's the kind of argument that he's making. Now, I think, and perhaps this is uncharitable on my part, but we've all been, or many of us who are engaged in these kinds of, you know, these kinds of ideas or problems, we've all been engaged in these kinds of student activism, or even outside of student activism as adults. We all know, we've all had these kinds of experiences. And I sadly think that he extrapolated from an experience that he had while a student, which he talks about in the book, and generalize it and tries to build a theory to take down what he calls identitarianism, or mistaken identity, as the title of the book says, working from this very particular incident. Now, it's not that these incidents don't exist, and there have been excellent critiques by radical collectives that have talked about the way in which identity has been attached to elite interests. And, you know, I think a much more interesting take on this is Olufemi Taiwo's book, Elite Capture, for example, which I think, you know, has some overlap with the way in which I discuss it in The New Racial Regime. So this kind of way in which various kinds of, I guess, anti-racist approaches can be taken in order to enforce quite racist, you know, practices. But I'm less interested in it as a kind of, how to put it, I'm less interested in it as a kind of like the kind of process that Assad Haider tries to identify, because what that would imply is that, to put it crudely, it's somehow our fault. And I think this is also the kind of direction in which that Ash Sarkar goes in her book on, what's it called? Minority
Rule.
Minority Rule. Thank you. So there's this idea that the left, again, what is the left, right? Or people on the left or groups on the left put out these ideas, and that the right takes them and subverts them, right? And I just
Hmm.
don't, and then the implication is that we're coming up with bad ideas. And if we just didn't have these bad ideas, then everything would be okay.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
think what I'm trying to argue is that that is quite an ahistorical and unthought through and kind of knee jerk reaction to what's happening, because there are many ideas that are out there in society, right, that have been developed within various movement practices, historical tendencies, and all the rest of it. They evolve for a reason. They're in constant flux. The idea of fixating on a moment which kind of responds to a particular zeitgeist, which in the end of the day, whether we think it went in a good direction or not, was trying to respond to the recognition globally that there was just this, how to put it, like overwhelming extent of state murder of Black people by police in the US, but also elsewhere. Because here in Australia, completely, there's so many parallels with the experiences of many Indigenous people, which is why Black Lives Matter had such a resonance or continues to have such resonance here. So the idea that the attempt to kind of counter this was all, badly thought through and led to bad ideas like safe spaces and trigger warnings and this kind of caricature, almost bogeyman idea that, well, if you just hadn't had that thought, then we wouldn't be where we are
Hmm.
now, as if imperialism didn't exist, as if racism didn't exist, as if racial capitalism wasn't a thing. These are the forces that we're dealing with. What students or other kind of activists are coming up with at various times, which many of them might look back 5 years later and say, yeah, maybe that wasn't great, right? But they're working it out as they go along.
Hmm.
To fixate on those things and to say, this is what's sending us to hell in a handcart, instead of, like, again, Western imperialism being the thing, or racial capitalism or settler colonialism being the thing. This is a problem for me. And I guess
Hmm.
just to end, what I'm really worried about in terms of thinking about the popularity of again, Assad Haider's book or Sarkar's book, and maybe more so with Sarkar than with Assad Haider, who I think it was brought out by Verso, which is still an independent publisher. But the amount of publicity and kind of mainstream attention to these ideas always really worries me, because obviously you're speaking to something that people in the mainstream desire, right? They want to hear that identity politics has gone too far. But they don't
Hmm.
really want to hear that imperialism or racial capitalism are the primary contradictions.
Hmm.
So this is the impulse of my critique, and why I think that ultimately we can do a lot better to complexify the relationship between race and class,
Hmm.
and not to think about these things as opposing tendency. Then there's a lot of more other things that I said in the new racial regime, on the way this was operationalized in the context of the attack on history. But maybe, yeah, I've already spoken for a long time.
No, I think that's really
Sorry,
interesting. That
every
just
answer is too long. I'm sorry.
no, I love it. I love it. Um, I think just to say, I think just like there are parallels in Australia, here as well in Germany. I mean, the treatment of people from African descendants or Caribbean descendants, or just migrants, and from
Mm,
Turkey with the guest workers and so. It's something. It's really a. I mean, it's. We can make a whole episode on this, and hopefully we will. But it is, like you said, what happens in America, somewhat is a microcosm of what happens elsewhere. I just wanted to highlight that. Um,
mm,
but also, I think also just to add to your point, you mentioned as well, you give the example, for example, that in the new racial regime, that CLR James was a little bit, I don't want to say frustrated, but he left a certain leftist group
mm,
because he thought it was a vanguard movement. And for example, in Aaron Kundnani's book, What is Anti-Racism or Why It Means
mm,
Anti-Capitalism, he sort of goes back and says, for example, even here in Germany, I think it was in Stuttgart in the early 20th century, there was like a conference, and the question of race came up, and sort of, people sort of treated it as if like it's let's say some people, not everyone, but some people treat it as like a peripheral issue.
Mm,
And while yes, there is like popular books today, such as the ones that you've mentioned and many more, from the left that sort of sees race as, like you say, we need to think about it differently, or like it's sort of like secondary to like class, or as if like this whole problem with like these students theorizing, maybe not the greatest theories, whatever, but like is the
mm.
entire problem of why that people why people are fed up and why people are sort of there's a reaction towards race and so on and so forth. It seems that this has been going on for, would I be correct in saying that it's not just a contemporary phenomena or something that's been going on for a while?
Yeah, no, definitely it's not a contemporary phenomenon. In fact, these things keep coming up again and again. And that's the idea of the racial regime. So, I mean, just to come to that, I think it's just a useful way of explaining it. I mean, Cedric Robinson develops this idea, or doesn't really develop it, to be honest with you. He kind of talks about it in the preface to his book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, which is a book about the invention of blackness through US cinema. Um, and he talks about the emergence or the invention or the recalibration, which is his terminology that I take up in the book, of the racial regime at the point in which US US imperialism or US imperialism is instigated. So the US, having settled the entirety of Turtle Island, turns its sights on territories outside of this particular continent and starts to invade and uh, areas such as we know, Haiti, Puerto Rico, etc., and starts to become the kind of global imperial power that we know of it today. And it's at this point that Chadwick Robinson argues there's a need for a recalibration, a
Mhm.
shift, or a kind of a slight change to the racial regime around the way in which in US culture via cinema, which is his primary example, but there's a lot of other examples that he draws on in the book, starts to constitute blackness in a particular way in order to justify, I guess, US imperialist interests outside of its own remit. And also, and this is very important, in order to cohere this idea of, I guess, a white American nation, which can start to include immigrants who, until this point, are not considered, or not all of them are until this point considered white. And I think, inter alia, to attach it to our previous discussion of Zionism, this is how, to use Karen Brodkin's phrase, how the Jews become white. And this is various ways in which, Jews are allowed to enter into whiteness, and that this, constitutes Zionism very much within the ambit of white supremacy, etc. But leaving that aside, so the beauty, or if you like, the utility, I shouldn't say beauty, the utility of the concept of the racial regime is that it's a set of representational mythologies, as Cedric Robinson would put it, which allow us, which kind of shape shift and shape themselves around, or shapes itself around the context of, or the current conjuncture, as Stuart Hall would put it, right? And so this recalibration is by degrees. It's not a wholesale change, but as Cedric Robinson would say, or says in the preface to the book, it takes old cloth and articulates it with new, or stitches it together with new cloth in order to kind of slightly change the parameters of what we're talking about. And this is why it's so adaptable and useful for thinking about how race continues to articulate itself with so many other processes, and why, in my view, it continues to be so central to our ability to understand why this sort of why the management of human difference remains so crucial to how states can operate. So in regard to your question, this is definitely not a new process. Rather, it's kind of a rehashing of old debates that have existed um, for much longer. In terms of dating it, I think you can see them emerging almost as soon as people started to discuss what is colonialism, what is imperialism. We can see it if, I mean, I think a very useful figure for tracing the evolution of ideas around this is, of course, W.E.B. Du Bois, because, of course, over his long lifetime, so, he died at the age of 93, I think, in 1961, I think. And over the course of his lifetime, he himself, which he reflects on in Dusk of Dawn, so 1940s was one of his two, I think, autobiographies. He talks about his changing relationship to the concept of race over the course of his life, over the course of his career, from somebody who really, I guess, saw race as being really about the distinction between black and white, and his assertion of, I guess, the wholly different experiences of black people with regards to other peoples, to his understanding via his travels to Africa principally, but also to many other locations in the world, how the experiences of black people were really very similar to the ways in which colonialism organized other negatively racialized people. So when he talked about the global color line at the end of the 19th century, and then he takes this up again in 1903, what he's really talking about is this distinction again between Europeanness and non-Europeanness. I mean, that's the language that I like to think about it as signifying, and that leads him to kind of rethink what the concept of race is doing. So the concept of race is really about installing whiteness as the owner of the earth. Right? I think that's the terminology that he uses, and that's the way he thinks about how what we would call racial capitalism is installed. This idea of legitimizing the ownership of the earth, the possession that what Aileen Morton Robinson would call the white possessive, justifying this through the superiority of Europeans and thus their manifest destiny to own the earth and to um, put to work everybody else in the service of white power. Um, and as long as those kinds of ideas were there were people saying, yes, but focusing on this misses the wider picture, which is class. But of course, that doesn't take into account, it doesn't answer the question of why it was possible for so many quote unquote white workers to become incorporated into whiteness, what Du Bois referred to as the wages of whiteness. But Cedric Robinson also takes up in his very interesting critique of the English working classes and Black Marxism.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, thank you for that. I think we have time for maybe one, maybe two, if I'm cheeky, questions. Um, Maybe this is just going to be a little bit of a knee jerk, like to a different topic, but it is a question
Mm,
that gets asked a lot, and yeah, I don't know, maybe it's a little bit vulgar, but it is a question that is asked a lot on the left. So if you could help us what's it called, clarify for us. I think sometimes whenever you go into left spaces, for example, and we talk about racialization and race, it has one sometimes there is this sort of in Germany it's I would say it's like an Islamophobic trope or like an
mm,
Islamophobic reaction, which is immediately they would say, well, we try to engage with people marginalized or racialized communities.
mm,
However, these racialized communities are um, I don't know, they use a lot of euphemisms, for example. They don't have quote unquote class consciousness, or they're patriarchal, or they're this, that, or the other, like completely sort of doing away with that part. And the reason why I say it's vulgar, I think it's because, I mean, if one believes that, you're going to overthrow capitalism or whatever through the working class or whatever, like you said, I mean, the world majority is racialized, so I don't know how you're going to go about doing that. But maybe you answered this a little bit, but I just wanted to laser focus this. I think this is a question that gets asked a
mm.
lot. And then there's just the final small question, maybe it's a big question, but thing, which is, what's the relationship between race and gender? I mean, it's like a sort of like a curveball, but yeah, these two questions, if you don't, yeah.
Yeah. Well, on the first question, I think, yeah, wherever you have leftist movements in the West, you have these problems. They recur ad nauseum across all the contexts in which I've lived and worked, which is plenty. And I think, how to put it, I think this is firstly based on what we were talking about before, just the inability, but or the unwillingness to accept the relationship, the imbrication of race in class, and the inability to separate between the two. But I think this is also an assertion of white supremacy within these contexts, even though the left likes to see itself as being opposed to racism. I think because they have askant many, I don't want to generalize, but many of these movements who pose these kinds of problems, or people who pose these kinds of problems, don't wish to educate themselves about, the true nature of racial capitalism, and like to think of themselves as kind of heralding an era in which race, will kind of wither away with the state. But like I always like to say, you can't undo something that you're unwilling to talk about or you're unwilling to deal with. And to relate it very slightly to the issue of gender, it would be like talking about deconstructing the gender hierarchy, or the straitjacket of gender without talking about gender. Like
Hmm.
obviously everybody would see that as being ridiculous, but somehow when it comes to race, there's this idea that racism is going to disappear if we just don't talk about race, if we don't think about it. And I think that's really just very weird on a very basic level.
Hmm.
Um, the other reason that I think, I mean, there are a couple of other reasons why I think this keeps coming up as a problem. One of them is pointed out uh, very well, I think, by one of the founders of the Black People's Union, which is an Indigenous union in so-called Australia, Kieran Stewart Asherton. He's quite critical of leftist tendencies in so-called Australia, which refuse to recognize themselves as settlers and settler colonialism as an ongoing process. For many people within these kinds of leftist movements that attract a lot of kind of young students to their ranks and so on, is that, yes, colonization happened, invasion happened, and then it was done and dusted. And then what we really need to think about is the existence of, I guess, class warfare within Australia, which I suppose they would theorize is no longer useful to be thought about as a settler colony. And what this does, of course, is completely efface Indigenous sovereignty and disregard or refuse to contend with the existence of all of us who are settlers on unceded sovereign Aboriginal lands in the ongoing colonization of these lands, which, admitting that and speaking about it openly doesn't necessarily resolve the problem. And I think, like in the context of Zionism, the only real resolution to the problem is the return of land to Indigenous people, and probably the removal of settlers where possible from the land, or the voluntary, I should say, removal. But that's just my own view. I think other people would argue that rather than doing that, we should stay and fight. But whatever it is, what we're fighting is settler colonialism and racial capitalism. That's the primary contradiction within this context in a settler colony, and disregarding that and disrespecting Indigenous people's sovereignty, I think, is extremely, extremely callous from a settler perspective. So that's one body of critiques, which I think is really important, led by, again, Indigenous activists and thinkers. The other thing that I've witnessed myself in various European spaces in which I was active before I moved here was, I guess, the feeling of disempowerment that many white activists saw with the growing ability of negatively racialized people. Particularly, I'm thinking about migrant workers in Italy, where I was active for quite a long time. Their ability to self-organize without the need of the white movement to support them. So the entire basis for the kind of 19, I guess I wrote about this in my first book, which is a really long time ago, but I think it came out in 2004, so that's a really long time ago, which is on European anti-racism. This notion of solidarity, which was so much driving, I guess, white anti-racist movements from the 1950s on, which kind of saw white people's solidarity with migrants as being so fundamental to anti-racism that led to them treating the actual victims of racism as tokens for their own activism, and sometimes allowing them to speak, right? But they were the main drivers of the movements.
Hmm.
When people of color black and brown people turned around and said, no, actually, this is racist. You're compounding racism by treating us as tokens. We can organize ourselves and we don't require you to organize on our behalf. Of course, we want your solidarity, but we don't want you to speak for us. That's when you had this flip and you started to hear this narrative coming out quite strongly from many of these, I guess, erstwhile movement leaders saying, oh, these people don't really want liberation. I heard, I actually quoted this in the paper, but from a one particular organizer who's also quite a well-known scholar. Oh, well, in the Italian context, as soon as people get their papers, which is all they really want, they kind of lose interest in activism. And I said, well, that's their right. Their right is, they've come here, they're working, they're paying taxes, they want to be regularized so that they can live normal lives with their families. That is their right, as is the right of every people. So the idea that you shouldn't mess with those people, you shouldn't work with those people because anyway, that's all they really want. Firstly, you don't know that, but secondly, it's also not up to you. Okay. And I think when those kinds of activists started to see, black migrants able to, get 10,000 people out on the street, um, with a couple of phone calls, whereas they could only pull like maybe 30 people in a room for a few chats, that's when you started to hear those kinds of discourses because it was about the loss of their own power.
Yeah. I think this relates so much with my own personal experience with my own
Yeah.
personal experience here in Germany. But um yeah, I think for the first part about the Italian left, um, I think the behind the scene, like what they when they say, for example, as soon as they get their papers, they don't care. I mean, they don't look at the context of, like, for example, maybe that particular person's entire family sort of put in like a fund so that they can, so he can traverse the sort of Mediterranean, so that sort of dodging basically death and stuff like this, so that he
Mm.
can not to live freely like the whatever, but to send money back and like
Yeah.
these things are really really complicated. Um, but yeah, I mean, thank you for your time. This has been really really lovely and enlightening, and um, um, yeah, I'm sure hopefully we can have you on again some other time. But before we go, is there something that you want to mention, or is there something that you want to say?
No, I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm really happy to have connected with you. I guess, this is the new book, The New Racial Regime. Yeah, you have it there too.
Oh,
I'd encourage
yeah.
people to, I think, thank you. Yeah, yours doesn't
Yeah.
have the post-it notes, which make it look messy. But
Yeah.
what I want to say is that, what I'm really hoping, I wrote this book because somebody just reviewed the book and said that I think they noticed that I was very enraged or angry at the state of the world, and they wrote that in. And I think, that is what motivates all of my writing and my thinking. And what I really wanted to do was start a dialogue with other people who are frustrated by um, obviously not just the state of the world, but also reactions to it and how we as anti-racists are contending with this recalibration of the racial regime. I hope that this heuristic from Cedric Robinson, who's all of his work is just so important and I think hasn't been engaged with enough. I think I really think it's a useful tool. And I really hope that people start to engage it and think about how they can use it to understand things more clearly. And I'm more than happy to talk to anybody who, if you want to drop me a line, I'm quite, available on the internet and so on. I'm more than happy to engage with anybody who has any questions.
Nice. I think that's the main reason why we called it Black Radicals after after his magnus opus. But yes, yeah, thank you so much, and hopefully we can have you again.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye.